Welcome back. So in this video, we're going to make our first attempt at including our own custom data in the output of our queries and not just depend on data that's already in tables. And you can combine these. You can, say, pull 3 columns from a table, but then you can have an additional 2 columns that are data that you define in the logic of your query. It's a lot easier than it sounds, so let's go ahead and get started. So since the point of this is to create your own data in your query that is not dependent on or tied to a table necessarily, we'll actually write our first query independent of a table altogether. So we'll start by clicking New Query, and we'll just type select 1 and click Execute. And there's our output. We created a query that just output the number 1. Now we remember aliasing from the last video, so I could say select my number equals 1. And now our query has a single column called my number with the value 1 in it. So you notice this 1 doesn't need to have any quotes around it, any brackets around it. But what happens if I type select my name equals Travis? That is not how you spell Travis. I should know how to spell my own name. And then we click Execute. So SQL gets confused because Travis is not a number. Travis is a text string. And that leads us to a topic that we'll have to cover very briefly to make sense of creating your own data in a select query. And that is categories of data that you find in a database. Now, these are informal categories. These aren't explicitly defined anywhere in the database, but generally speaking, the data that you interact with is going to come in 3 flavors. One is text strings, and that would be like your name, my name, Travis, your name, whatever that may be. One other type is numeric. That's like the number 1. It could be a number with decimals in it, but just a numeric value. And the third is date data, which really is its own animal, and that will require some specialized techniques to work with. So we're not going to dive into dealing with dates just yet, although we will later because it's a very important topic. But for now, we'll focus on string data, like your name, and numeric data. So we saw that when we're dealing with numeric data, we don't have to do anything special. We don't have to surround it with quotes. We can just select that value. When you're dealing with text strings, you need to surround them with single quotes. If we do that, suddenly it works. So we've seen how to do this, just selecting a value essentially out of thin air. But how do we include this in a query? Well, let's go ahead and use our little shortcut to select the top 1,000 rows from the human resources.employees table. And here's that auto-generated query that SQL Server Management Studio provides us. But what if I wanted to add a column to this query saying who the query author is, like me? So I'll actually add a column at the beginning of this query called query author. And then my name, which I once again misspelled. Maybe I should just go ahead and change my name to Travus. Might be a little bit more convenient. Now we'll make sure there's commas in between all the column names, and we'll click Execute. And there we are. So when you hard code or manually enter data as a column in a query, then that value appears on every row of that query output. And it's the same value every time. So if, for example, I had done select top 10, same deal. 10 rows of data, and the query author is just Travis on every one of those rows. And if I wanted to say which query this is that we've written, how many of all the queries we've written so far, which one is this? Maybe it's the 10th. So I could say query number equals 10. Actually, let's clean this up and put the comma ahead of the column name. It's really just a stylistic preference. There's no real advantage to doing it one way or the other, but some people like the commas before the column names. Some people like the commas after the column names. So whatever your preference is, just try to be consistent with it so it's a little less confusing. All right. And now we have query author Travis, query number equals 10. That's simple. Now later on, we'll get into being able to actually do calculations on columns in our data that can produce new derived values that are a little more interesting than just the same number appearing or the same name appearing over and over again in every row. All right, so now that we've got a handle on text data versus numeric data, that will segue nicely into what we're going to get into next, which is actually applying criteria to our data, and in particular, criteria to either text values in our data or numeric values in our data, so that we can filter out records that we're not interested in, which will get more and more important as the size of the tables that we deal with grows. All right, that's all we got for this one, so I'll see you in the next video.